Welcome, everybody, to the Artisan Church All-Inclusive Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Josephus.
And I'm Reed Conley, pastor of Artisan Church. And today we have a very special guest. I'm so pleased to let you know that we have the Reverend Dana Seiler with us today from Unity Presbyterian. So, Dana, we're so glad that you're here. We have so many fond memories in the life of Artisan Church going up to this point. And glad that you're here to chat with us today. It's a real honor to have you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Good. Well, we would like to know a little bit more about you today. So maybe we can talk about some of your story. We know that you're the associate pastor at Unity, but maybe if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could tell us about your story and your journey to this point.
Okay.
Particularly in the faith realm. We want to talk about faith today.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll give you the shorter version of my story. Otherwise, we would be here all day. But I grew up in a home that I guess we could say was a Christian home, although we did not practice, and we never went to church. And I remember a traumatic event happening in our family when I was about 10. And so I turned to my mom and said, I'm going to need you to start dropping me off at the church at the bottom of the hill. And so she would drop me off at church for Sunday school. And then after Sunday school, I'd walk over to the sanctuary, big church, and attend church by myself. And then my mom would come back and pick me up. And so I did this for probably about a year and was baptized in that year. And then got away from the church probably until my mid-20s. So I lived a long span of time, not really seeking after God and not really curious about faith or Christianity. And during that span of time, I think I turned to more Eastern philosophy as a faith practice rather than Christianity. Read a lot about Buddhism and shamanism and Taoism, and just kind of took a little bit from each of those faith traditions and formed my own credence, and just tried to live by that philosophy of just being a good person and creating a greater good, and believed a lot in karma, I would say, during that time frame. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. That's very personal about your journey and very interesting. So there's clearly something that happened in between where you find yourself now as a pastor. So I'm curious where that step took place too.
Yes. Yeah. So mid-20s, I'm going to UNCW Wilmington and I just started being curious. There was this little inkling inside of me that thought, well, I wonder what this church over here is doing. And so I ended up going to a pretty large church in Wilmington that was doing a lot of outreach for college students in that area, and just found my place there. And when I say that I started going there, I mean, I was like once every other month and thought I was a regular attender. And what's so ironic is that when I think back to it, there was one service. It was the Sunday after New Year's or right after Christmas, and the pastor was preaching on what's your word for the year. And we had these little cards and we wrote down our word, and mine was commitment. And I was going to commit to going to church twice a month. That was a huge leap for a college student.
That's a step.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, but now fast forward, right? Like decades later, and now I'm a pastor in church every Sunday, like leading it. So that commitment on that particular Sunday really came to flower into something else that I had no idea.
Are you still only at 2 times?
I try to be. I really try to be. So I left Wilmington and started a master's program in social work and finished my master's. I started a PhD in professional counseling with pastoral care. And that is about the time that I ended up getting a job as a youth director, which is a very interesting story as to how I became a youth director. But you can kind of see how God was just opening doors and putting me on a certain path. So when they asked me to start doing these religion courses for the PhD program, I was staying up all night reading theology books, so about 4 a.m, which is, as we know, a very abnormal behavior.
It doesn't happen by accident.
That does not. Yes. And so I thought, well, I'm just, this is weird, right? So I talked to the pastor that I was working for at the time, and he said, well, what do you think about going to seminary instead of just doing another counseling degree? And so I went and toured the seminary in Richmond and loved it. And every obstacle and rebuttal that I had regarding seminary was just answered during that tour and during those interviews. And so it was just confirmation that was the next step.
So did you not get to finish the PhD?
I did not. No, I transferred over to do another master's. Yeah.
God had another plan.
Yes, absolutely.
That is a beautiful story.
Yeah, that was, that was concise too. That was a quick story. A lot of information in a quick time.
Yeah.
We could learn a thing or two about getting those out.
Particularly a lot of information that's not a very straight and not the path that you thought you'd be on, and it had some turns. And I think that's how a lot of faith journeys are. And mine is similar as well, in that this isn't where I thought I would be 20 years ago, for
Being
sure.
a video gamer, one thing I've noticed about a lot of our stories and a lot of the stories that we've been hearing is it seems like there's this discovery in the youth, or there's a presence in the household that doesn't necessarily always get met, so to speak, going to church actively with the parents. And then around your early teens and stuff like that, you might elect to go on your own. And then there's just this gap around the college ages. And then all of a sudden you just find there's a spark somewhere that if I had to write a guide on what it spiritual journeys look like, it would be something like that, because it seems to be a consistent pattern in those stories we've been hearing.
Yeah, I think there's something about wanting to go for you know, and there's a space in between sometimes where your family is leading or not leading your spiritual path, and then you come to a place where maybe you need it for yourself, and then you make that decision for yourself at some point. So that is definitely a common theme.
Can I ask a question? So being
Absolutely.
Somebody who
You're
also,
a host.
Well, no, I didn't know if you had something you wanted to lead with real quick, but it was about her story. You sort of were like me, where your parents didn't go. I had my mom or my grandmother drop me off at church, and I wanted to know that time frame was what was the thing you think that when you did transition out for a short period, what do you think was do you have a do you know what made you walk away initially? Was it just because you were leaving the area of the church that you were comfortable with, or what got you away from it? Because it was interesting for me, is just I became an adult, but not really. And it was wait, I'm noticing things that it just doesn't make sense to me. So did you have a realization, or was it just you moved away from something and it just didn't follow you?
Yeah. So why did I gravitate away from the church?
Right.
Yes. So I would say it's a combination of things. My friend sphere was not very let's go to youth group kind of group, and also just not processing my family of origin issues. So lots of wounds that were left open that led me in a different direction until later in life when I did actually process those. And yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing. I know that's a rough one sometimes, but I just wanted to know, because it's interesting how we elect to go, even when our parents aren't going. And then you would think that, you're in this great space. Why would you ever leave it? You chose to be, you know what I mean? You chose to be there on your own as a younger person.
Right. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's just hey, where did I turn?
Hey, Dana, I have a follow-on question to Josephus's, which is, so a lot of people, when you got to college, when you got to seminary, and you had said that you had gone through this faith journey of going into Eastern philosophical kind of religions and things like that. What was it that drew you back to Christianity? Because if you've explored all of those other ones, what was the catalyst for getting you back into Christianity?
That is a good one. Man, that wasn't on the list that I prepared for, so we'll reject that one. Good one, but sorry. Yeah, so I guess as I'm thinking back on it now, knowing where my life went, the direction it went in, I remember a stirring in my spirit. There was a restlessness that was there and a curiosity. And I now having nurtured my faith and knowing God and hearing God's voice and knowing what that voice sounds like, it was definitely God kind of moving in me and trying to put me on the path that I was supposed to be on. And luckily, I listened. Luckily, I thought, okay, I'm going to take this right-handed turn into this parking lot and go to this church and kind of answer that call a little bit.
So even within the halls of intelligentsia, when you were studying all of this, it still clicked with you. That kind of a faith journey started to click.
Yes, which I think we could say, I think I could say with confidence that even though I was practicing might be a stretch, even though I believed in Eastern philosophy and was drawn to that more, and even though that interest in Christianity started to emerge, I think I found God in all of those things. And so it didn't matter to me if I was sitting on a beach and experiencing God and the wind and the waves and the beauty of nature, or if I was sitting in church and hearing a sermon that really hit home for me and gave me life application, so that I could start to follow in Christ's footsteps a little bit more. I think I found God in all of those platforms.
Sure, and there's certainly some base notes in Eastern philosophy that can kind of jive with the philosophy and the teachings of Jesus, which is where you leaned into. It's not always butting heads, is it? It's
What was here Western philosophy, so I'm a little bit more familiar with that.
Yeah.
I've actually never really explored the opposite. So when you say Eastern, are we talking about like Muslim and Buddhist and stuff like that? Like, are we talking about those religions when we say Eastern, or is there actually like an Eastern side of Christianity, or like, can you elaborate just like a microcosm on that for me?
I'll let Pastor Dana take
Yeah.
that.
So I would say that I was reading more about Buddhism and shamanism and Taoism, and just different faith traditions. And that was early 20s, right? So I've just been fascinated by world faith traditions in general. And so even from that time, I've studied Islam. I am just fascinated with Hinduism. Yeah, and have tried to start writing this book about Hinduism and Christianity and the overlap and how certain deities in Hinduism really align with the language that we use to describe God. For instance, the three kind of founding deities in Hinduism is Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva. And they all have titles like the Trinity. Right? So one of them is the creator, the preserver, the destroyer. So there's all this language that is similar. It's just, it's similar, but slightly different. But man, there's a lot of overlap.
One of the things that really always fascinated me and also kind of had me thinking, or like triggered my brain to think, is we have all these like religions, and I always thought it was interesting because there is a lot of overlap in many of them. Like there's common messages that, translate. There's usually like some minute details or to some major details that might hit or miss. But I thought it was interesting that like maybe the idea of religion is not necessarily the things that aren't off, that don't sync up, more so as like, what is the common theme through these religions? And I think that it's interesting, because people sometimes argue over who delivered the message, but it's like, did you get the message? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I always thought about it like that. It's like, I don't really I'm not going to argue with somebody over being Muslim versus being Christian. It's like we both have a message that kind of lines up in certain aspects. Did you get the message being a good person to your neighbor and stuff
or maybe the value is peace.
the value. Exactly.
So if your faith tradition values peace, and you're coming head to head and saying, no, my value of peace is better than yours, and we're going to fight about it.
Or my messenger is better than yours. Like the name we call the person is better, so you should just see it our way. Like,
Yeah.
like that was one thing with the different religions for me. It was just like, because like you said, I've seen some of the statues and stuff like that for the Hindu gods, and they're like really beautiful. Like,
they are.
I'm drawn to the art that goes into some of these. Like,
to throw a monkey wrench in there, I always thought, and this is a Ghostbusters reference, I always thought Gozer was the destroyer.
Sorry, but no.
Oh, okay.
Incorrect.
I think you really crossed the streams there.
Oh,
I'm
nice.
sorry. We're going to have to move on.
who gave him a mic?
Yeah. So Josephus, just going back to your point, I do think that there's this common thread amongst all religions, faith traditions of creating a greater good. There's,
Right.
There's service and just leaving the world better than it was, not harming your neighbor, loving your neighbor like yourself. You see that through and through. The only difference that I have found with Christianity is that it's the one religion that gives us hope.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's really a defining marker. And for me as a professing Christian, I really enjoy having that hope and that message of hope in my life. And it brings a lot of value and meaning.
Yeah, the hope is what carries us through the tough times like nothing else.
Yeah.
I'd like to explore this a little bit more in the context of how we as a church might observe and respond and interact with other faith traditions. So, and I know that you have had some experience with that in your work in church, and maybe you could share a little bit about how you've engaged with other faith traditions, and also follow up, like, has the process and has the response always been positive?
Yeah. So I'm going to go off on a little bit of a sidebar and then I'll lump it all together.
All right, great.
Okay. So I feel like in the past 2 decades, maybe even a little bit longer, we've been having interfaith panels, interfaith discussion, which is great because we needed to bring awareness around the fact that Judaism and Islam and Christianity have a lot of overlap, a lot of the same beliefs and the same God. They just, Jesus is a defining conflict right
That's
there.
kind of the sticking point.
And when
Yeah,
you
that's
talk
the
about
sticking point.
interfaith, you're talking about like between Christianity and the Jewish religion, like, having the
All
conversation.
Of them. All
okay.
of them. Yes. And so we've had a whole lot of dialogue. And I remember being in seminary and I was attending another interfaith panel. I've been fascinated by this topic for basically my whole life. So I've gone to a lot of panels. And I just thought, why do we just have dialogue? Like, where we are ready for the next part now. Where's the application? Mm-hmm. And that was one of my questions to the panel of, this is great. This is probably my 3rd panel in this month. Where are we actually going to do something about this? One suggestion being, how do we, if we're observing all of these Christian holidays in our school system and in the federal holidays, what is that communicating to our other members of our society that are Islam or Jewish? We don't recognize Hanukkah. We don't close the school down for Hanukkah, but we do on Christmas and banks.
Yeah, it's
and
been a
so
pretty
on.
slow rollout to even put those on the calendar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the past couple of years, I actually have heard about charter schools up in New Jersey and New York that are starting to observe some of the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that sort of things. But these are charter schools. It's a different setting and policies. So I think we're getting there slowly. So we've had all these panels. I'm seeing that we're going to need to start doing more than talking about it. So then at the last church that I served at, I decided to put together a series of workshops. And it was called Who is Your Neighbor? With the idea being, if we're supposed to love our neighbor, shouldn't we know who our neighbor is? So let's get to know our Baptist neighbors and our evangelical neighbors and our Pentecost neighbors. Let's learn about their faith practices, and let's see what our similarities are and what are our differences, and really just engage in community. This was all over breaking bread and, having dialogue and conversation, and also lectures afterwards. So that series, part 1 of my series of Who's Your Neighbor, went very well. Right, because that still is Protestant faith, right?
You're sticking with Christians,
yes.
Just different flavors of Christianity.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
So part 2 was the interfaith part, and that's where I brought in voices from the Baha'i community and the Buddhist community, Islam, and I think it was about a couple weeks before the classes were supposed to launch, and there was so much pushback in the church where they just didn't feel comfortable with that kind of learning environment, with inviting people into our church space that weren't actually Christian. There was a lot of stereotypes and generalities that were thrown around about our Islamic neighbors. And it was just pushing people out of their comfort zone, to the point that I realized that this was pushing my church past what they were able to do at that point. So then as a pastor, you have to say, okay, this is not where we are as a church, so we need to step back from this. So we did not have the second part of the series, which was very upsetting for me, because I just love this stuff, love talking about it. I think we have a lot to learn. I think there's a lot of awareness. So I think that particular instance shed light on how divided and contentious this can be for folks, and how it makes us feel uncomfortable. Like, we do not like it when somebody is telling us that we are wrong, or what we believe is wrong, or if we're surrounded by people who aren't like us, that don't really believe the things that we believe in.
I would say, if I were thinking from a more outside of Christianity mindset, if you want to see schools and the federal government recognize Hanukkah, let's figure out how to make retail stores make millions, if not billions of dollars from it. Because when you look at Christmas today, there's not very many people who celebrate Christmas in the essence of Christianity. It's, let's go buy everybody gifts, and let's just it's Christmas sometimes feels like it almost loses its punch. When you get around certain crowds, because, you see fights over who didn't get the best present, or who didn't, appreciate so-and-so. Who, not many people break out their Bibles or have a prayer at their Christmas and stuff like that. So, or let's see how many Christmases we can get to in the day.
If only the Hanukkah bush had taken off.
Right. I mean, it's just if we could have, so that, and that's not my, it's just, I've heard that be one of the conversations from outside of Christianity directed, towards people.
So in our culture, there's definitely like a soft entry point into Christianity.
Right.
Oh, we've got Christmas.
Right.
Right. So that's true. And I think that makes it more comfortable, at least in our corner of the world, to maybe be around Christians, because there's all varying degrees, and we just don't even have awareness. Thinking as a Christian who's maybe thinking about having dialogue with someone of a different faith, there's just so much that we don't know. But the only thing we know is, you don't believe what I believe.
Right.
So we already have this almost a conflict brewing.
Right.
Where we don't want to. We as people, I'm going to speak in very general terms, are not good at disagreeing, and so that's just the stress that builds up even just thinking about it.
Yeah.
We want to just run the other way and call that person, they're on the out. So I'm not surprised at the response that you got from your congregation, but it is sad that there couldn't just be a space.
It irritated me
even
because I just think it's why as people can we not just have a conversation? What is so hard about hearing someone else's viewpoint and it being just that, their viewpoint? It doesn't have to change who you are.
Yeah.
But the idea that we're so right that just bringing wrong around us will make us feel upset. Is crazy.
And it's even biblical that we might want to have peace with people of other faith traditions, I would like to lift this up while we just have a few more minutes left. In Romans chapter 12, verse 9 through 21, everyone should just go ahead and read that. It talks about the marks of being a Christian and what it looks like to be a follower of Christ. And we could read the whole thing right now, but I'll lift up a couple of highlights right now. Verse 16 says, "Live in harmony with one another. Do not be arrogant." Verse 17 says, "Take thought for what is noble in the sight of all." And verse 18, "If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all." So if we agree that all includes more than just people who believe what I believe, if it includes people of every denomination, of every faith tradition, all of God's children means everybody, then what does it look like for Christ followers to live that idea out in today's world? What does that look like? I think it looks a lot like organizing a conversation where we all come together and talk about other faith traditions.
Yeah.
You know what I realized? What was funny is like there's many different faith traditions, and typically they're separated by like a language barrier. We're easy to accept the fact that everybody speaks a different language, and we're not so quick to say, "Well, you don't speak this language, so you can't come here," or we're not offended by whatever language you don't speak, right? But the moment your religion comes into factor, what you've learned as a kid and stuff like that, it's like, well, that religion's wrong. It's, it's interesting to me.
Part of the thing I think that if I can interject, that kind of hinders us is the desire often to put the impetus for change on the other party. So it's not that, we could have a conversation as long as you are willing to change your viewpoint to what I believe is right. And so Christ was a leader, and he led by example. His humbleness and his love and his grace towards others that were different than themselves, even those that persecuted him, set the example. And so I think that we are increasingly a society of a lack of accountability and a lack of leadership towards our grace and our love towards others. And that can be a seed that can allow for that conversation, as long as we're not looking for them to change immediately to meet our definition of what they should be.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Rich. And I wondered too if there's the ego has to die, and sometimes that's a daily practice. But yeah, I think the ego, the self, has to let go of what we think is right, what we think is the only way, and just kind of allow many voices to come together. There's another passage in Jeremiah where God is talking to Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah 32, and he says, "I am the Lord your God of all flesh." And in the Hebrew meaning of all flesh, it is all humankind. So not just, our
not just the chosen people.
Right. So all humankind, God created all of us, and how his voice is heard and what language we use to describe God or to be in relationship with God is really based on where we are born and the sort of home that we were in or what we were exposed to. All of us were born in the West, in the Western part of the world. And so our language, especially for us Southerners, is the Bible and Jesus. And, we are in the Bible Belt here. But if you were to be born in China, your language for God would be totally different. It would be more of a Buddhist understanding. It would be energy. It would be karma. It would be do good. And so I think just realizing how much our geographical location plays a factor into this, and how we are raised, and the values and the language that's passed on to us from our families is a big influencer. But Scripture does say that God is in all of humankind.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about, because I know in my faith tradition growing up, in an evangelical context, most of the talk about good news and finding your place in the kingdom of God was all about bringing about the agenda of I need to tell other people so that they can convert and believe what I believe. And that's the whole point of everything that we do. And that's the whole point of any good that I do, is to eventually turn it around to the point where I'm converting you, you know?
Yeah.
I'm going to show God's love and kindness so that I can tell you about the good news, and we can get you to say that sinner's prayer, you know? And I think that is so pervasive, particularly where we are in the Bible Belt, where, you know, that sharing the good news kind of overshadows any other thoughts about how we might coexist, or how we might bring this peace that is really what we're after. And so I want to ask everyone, how do we balance that, and how do we find our particular voice to say that coexisting with all of God's children is how we ought to be showing God's goodness and the good news of Jesus Christ?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I do have one example.
Okay.
One instance that where I saw this occurring, and it was in India. So I spent about a month in India and went around to a lot of different cities and towns. And there was one city that I was in, and there was a huge Christian church there. And they were building a new building. It was millions of dollars, this building. And so just imagine this. We're in like a deeply impoverished country that's building a huge church, millions of dollars, and thousands of people and Christian. I say people, I'll get to that point in a minute. People and Christians are coming there. And so I started reading their mission statement and what they believed. What are their beliefs? What messages are they putting out there to their community? And one of them, one of the bullet points in their mission statement was, anybody of any faith can come here and worship your God in our space. And so they had Christians that were there on Sunday morning. This was totally a Christian service. So think full-on liturgy, sermon, everything. But there were Buddhists, and there were Hindus, and there were people who were coming there just to experience God in however they were worshiping that day. And it was successful. There was tons of people that were coming there because there wasn't a dividing line. There wasn't a sticking point that this is what we believe. This is how you become a member and you adopt our beliefs. And this is how you apply our beliefs. It was come here and worship just as you are in our space and experience God however God's communicating to you in this environment.
That is dope.
That's
like
beautiful.
that.
Yeah.
That'd be really cool.
And there are probably little pockets of that around us where one congregation might share their space with someone else. But that is, to say it's in your mission statement is another thing. And what a beautiful expression of what something really holy happening, to say that we value you as people, not just as converts to what we believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I like that.
It gives us something to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to listen to this podcast. We look forward. We'll have to have you come back, if you will.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not done. I feel like there's so much more to talk about and explore.
We have just scratched the proverbial surface here. But
yeah, so we'll call this part one.
Part one.
Part one.
I like it. All
All
right.
The first part one episode.
First part one episode.
I'm going to have to put part one now.
It's out there. So, yeah. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and listening. And we hope you come back and join us again next time on the podcast.
Thank you. Adios.
All right. Bye-bye.